Welcome to the Panorama panel discussion for the fall 2018 semester. My name is Michaela Graham, and I will be serving as a moderator for this event. Just a reminder that this event today is a Windows to the World sanctioned event credit. This panel series is an opportunity for GSW community members to come together and voice their opinions on today's relevant topics. With help from the panelists, we hope that together we will all engage in intellectual reasoning through conversation. The topic for today is activism in the age of social media. Through today's discussion, we will explore a series of questions pertaining to the very relevant use of mass communication. Some of these questions include the use of hashtags in many social movements, such as hashtag Black Lives Matter and hashtag MeToo movement. We will address how social media plays a big role in modern day politics and the reforming of major social issues such as gun control and abortion rights, as well as other similar topics. However, what will best help to forward this discussion and keep it lively is you, and the questions you ask during the question and answer portion of this event. So do not be afraid to speak up and voice your opinion. I would like to first start to begin by introducing the members of our panel. Then I will briefly explain the procedural details of the panel discussion. Our panelists today are Dr. Anish Devi. Dr. Anish Devi has a PhD in rhetorical and an MFA in creative writing and an MBA in marketing. He has taught at GSW for 8 years. His articles have appeared in Technical Community Quarterly and Research and Teaching of English. Recently, he published a book chapter analyzing President Trump's foreign policy tweets. Our next panelist is a GSW student, Mark Hubbard. He is pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Political Science and a minor in History. Our next panelist is Dr. Evan Kutzler. Dr. Kutzler is an assistant professor of history at Georgia Southwestern State University. He teaches U.S. history, multiple classes in public history, as well as civil rights and Civil War and Reconstruction. He is the author of Ossabaw Island, A Sense of Place, Mercer University Press, 2016. Co-editor of Prison Pen's Gender, Memory, and Imprisonment of the Writing of Molly Scally and Wash Nelson, 1863 to 66, University of Georgia Press, and an author of Living by Inches, The Sound, Smell, and Taste of the Feeling of the Civil War Prison. Our next and final panelist is Dr. MC Whitlock. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Georgia Southwestern State University. She has a master's degree in women and gender studies and a PhD in sociology from the University of South Florida. She is a critical psychologist who specializes in gender, sexuality, intersectionality, and social movements. She is currently working on a book about the feminist bookstores in the U.S. South with the emphasis on race and sexuality in the feminist social movements. Now I will discuss the procedures. Each panelist has been asked to prepare opening remarks about activism in the age of social media. Once our panelists have made their opening remarks, we will transition to the question and answer portion of the event. During the Q&A forum, panelists will respond to the questions from the audience. For the Q&A, we will have mobile microphone attendants who will like to ask any questions or comment. Please raise your hand. One of our attendants will bring you a microphone. In the interest of time, we will also like to ask that questions or comments to the audience remain to 1 minute. Tonight's event is a Windows to the World sanctioned event. In order to earn Windows to the World credit, please be sure to swipe in with one of our representatives in the back of the room. You will be also sent a link to the program assessment, which you must complete to earn credit. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the GSW personal YouTube page. With further ado, let's begin with our first panelist, Dr. Anish Devi.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming here. And I'm very glad to start this discussion. I'm just lucky because the order is alphabetical. So let's begin. It's a very current topic, as all of you know. And my focus will be on global issues. I will also talk about what we think of activism in general in the age of social media. I will begin with the Arab Spring uprisings in 2010 and 11 and 12 that really were ignited because of social media. And then I will briefly speak about the Women's March after President Trump's inauguration. But I will be very brief in my remarks. And then I will have some concluding thoughts. So let's start with the Arab Spring uprisings. So the Arab Spring uprisings, which are very well known and famous and historic, were a series of uprisings that began in Tunisia in December of 2010. And the dictator of Tunisia had to flee the country. And Tunisia became a democratic country as a result. And then the uprising spread to the neighboring Egypt in January of 2011. And then it further spread to some other neighboring countries like Yemen, Bahrain, Libya, and Syria. And together, these uprisings were momentous because nobody really expected them to happen. There was little intelligence about them, and people didn't really anticipate these uprisings, and they left a lasting impact on the entire region. So, this is a quote from one of the books about these online activism or online protest movements. The internet allowed networks of activists in the Middle East and North Africa to connect before protests broke out in the region in late 2010 and early 2011. So researchers then researched this entire subject and found and talked to actual protesters or activists who participated in these uprisings and found that they had connected online before they came on the ground for their activism. The public sphere, and the reason for the Arab Spring uprisings were, they are captured in this quote. The public sphere was closed in these countries. The public sphere was closed, controlled, characterized by censorship, and ruled by fear. And so social media really became this medium where people express themselves, and they just found the medium to be a godsend. And because of that, the uprisings happened. In 2009, for example, at the time of the Gaza protests in Tunisia, there were only 28,000 people on Facebook. But by the end of 2010, the number of Tunisians on Facebook had exploded to 2 million. So in just a matter of 1 year, Facebook use had increased so much in this country. In 2011, the Arab Spring spread to Egypt. And this is an image of the Tahrir Square in Cairo, Egypt, where the protests took place. The protesters gathered there on Tahrir Square. And this is a quote from the same book by a Turkish writer that I have been reading about these online protests or demonstrations. One of the people she interviewed, she said that she had gone online to look for political conversations that were open and inclusive, and that this had led to her participation in the Tahrir protests. In Egypt, in 2011, only 25% of the population of the country was online, with a smaller percentage on Facebook. And yet people managed to change the wholesale public discussion. So it's not necessary for everyone to be involved. Only a small group can be involved online, and the repercussions can be astronomical or massive. And this is a a picture of an Egyptian young man who was killed by the Egyptian police in 2010, and he became an icon for protests in Egypt. There was a Facebook page created by one Mr. Wael Ghonim, who actually lived in some other country, a neighboring country, not even in Egypt, but he saw the news coverage of the death of this young man and was so agitated that he created a Facebook page, and later he created a Facebook event that invited people to Tahrir Square on January 25, 2011, which ended up deposing the Egyptian dictator, Hosni Mubarak. Here is another example of how social media can be helpful in activism, political activism. There was a Twitter handle called Tahrir Supplies, created by an Egyptian young man who lived in the Middle East, and he went on Twitter and he saw that there were these massive groups of people gathered on Tahrir Square, and there was some brutality by the law enforcement there, and some people were injured, some were killed, and there were makeshift hospitals that were created right there on Tahrir Square, and those hospitals needed some supplies. And so he saw on some Twitter handles that old tweets were retweeted again and again, and sometimes supplies gathered at one place, at one hospital, but the other hospital really lagged in supplies. So he created a Twitter handle called Tahrir Supplies and joined with a couple of other activists who lived in, one of them lived in London, two were in Cairo, and these four people, they created this Twitter handle and really organized the whole medical supplies business for the Tahrir Square protests. And as a result, they saved a lot of lives. However, since the Arab Spring, regime after regime has realized the power of social media. And so now they are much more aware of what social media can do, and they have begun to control social media. Recently, I was reading in the Washington Post that a Middle Eastern activist deleted her Twitter account, which had thousands and thousands of followers, because she feared repression and she feared some unpleasant consequences. So, on the other hand, there is a philosopher, a Korean philosopher, who believes that what we have on social media in the form of activism or expression is more of an outrage. He says that waves of outrage mobilize and bundle attention very efficiently. However, their fluidity and volatility make them unsuited for public discourse or for public space. And he says that this is all fine as far as expression is concerned, but it's not useful, that it doesn't amount to real concrete gains. What need is there? Another quote from his book. What need is there for parties today if everyone is a party, him or herself, if ideologies which once formed a political horizon have crumbled into countless individual opinions and matters of personal preference? Is democracy even possible without discourse? So these are some questions that he asks, which I'm sure ring true to most of us who have seen online activism. So concluding thoughts, there is no doubt that, these thoughts I offer in the context of the Women's March that happened in 2017, and it was repeated in 2018. And the Women's March was the largest protest in the US history. And it was around the world. And it had, it gathered a number of different people from various groups. However, when I did a bit of research on this particular march, and I found that there were some differences of opinion that really became significant. So my thinking is that there is no doubt that different groups of people experience different challenges. However, a march offers an opportunity to focus on common challenges. So instead of foregrounding differences, if people focused on common issues, I think we can have some concrete gains through online activism. Another thought, and I end my presentation with my favorite icon, Mahatma Gandhi, because I'm from India and he is my hero, has always been my hero. And Gandhi met with people. He protested against people, but he always met with his adversaries. He always engaged in a dialogue with his adversaries. He talked with them. He didn't run away from them. So a Gandhian practice of engaging with adversaries, engaging with our political opponents, is an idea worth considering for online activists. That is my suggestion. And that's all I have for you all. These are my references, and I hope I haven't taken too much time. And so the next, Dr. Kudzer. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'll mostly be talking about, or not global, but domestic issues here in the United States, the movements that have been going on recently. But first, let's establish what activism is and how has it evolved. So activism is simply the policy or action of using vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. We have seen this since the colonial times in the United States. With the Boston Tea Party, these movements were on the streets, and as technology has evolved, we have seen more movement towards the online platforms to not only pressure politicians but to also establish these marches. So why social media? According to a study by the Pew Research Center, we have actually seen approximately 70% of individuals in the United States, at least on one social media platform. So very large portions of people. Social media also connects people around the world with ease, and people can instantaneously see events that are occurring around the world. So, you could be in countries like Japan or South Korea and still see what's going on in the United States today. Young people are also tending to be using these social media platforms. So we're seeing a rise in the youth movements. And then finally, social media has allowed large groups to come together. And as Dr. Dave was talking about in Tahrir Square of Egypt, that was a leaderless revolution established by Facebook. That has not only managed to overthrow one government, but three, and is still ongoing in some cases. So I will be discussing three ongoing movements in the United States: the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the Get Out and Vote movement. So first, the Me Too movement. The Me Too movement started in 2006 with Tarana Burke, a woman of color who had survived sexual assault. She coined the phrase to help other people or other women who had survived sexual assault come together. And it was actually reignited by actress Alyssa Milano on Twitter by asking people to comment "Me Too" on her Twitter post if they had also survived sexual assault like she had. The movement has rapidly expanded since that day and have brought many powerful men, including actors Kevin Spacey and Bill Cosby, to the courtrooms and losing their jobs. And though the movement has had great success, Tarana Burke and other African American women who are activists in this movement have feel as the movement has lost its focus and have pushed to recenter African American women, including Tarana Burke actually spoke at an event 2 years ago in Chicago for a keeping Black women at the center of the Me Too movement, which was a town hall in Chicago. So the second movement is Black Lives Matter. The movement kicked off somewhat with the shooting of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, who was killed by George Zimmerman while walking down the street in his neighborhood. Though it kind of kicked off, it actually truly began after Mr. Zimmerman was acquitted of the murder. The movement looks to speak out against the violence that has been centered against the Black community and is looking to empower Black people into speaking out, and it's a chapter-based now. Not only is it online, but it's actually has a big community presence, and it has 30 communities or 30 chapters, including one in Atlanta, Georgia. So we have. And then the final movement I want to talk about today is the Get Out and Vote movement. This movement has been established by a lot of young people, college-age people and younger, and a lot of celebrities. The reason this movement has become so big with us, or our age, is because young people make up most of the social media users. Approximately 88% of young people use social media, according to Pew Research as well. And like the movement in Egypt, in Tahrir Square, it's a leaderless movement. It's people, everyday people, coming onto these websites such as Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and encouraging young people to vote, encouraging people to register to vote, and helping people find their polls, their local polls, because unfortunately a lot of people do not know where to even vote when they are registered. So that's pretty much the end of mine, and we'll go to Dr. Kutzler.
Good afternoon. My remarks reflect the way that historians contribute to topics that they don't know too much about, through deflection. My opening statement is this: it's that activism in the age of social media might go back farther than you think. It might be reasonable to define social media as having to be computer-based, but I think, from my perspective, social media has deeper roots than 21st century computers or smartphone applications. If we include print media, cheap print media, i.e. newspapers, the United States was born and came of age in a social media age since at least the early 19th century. This visualization that's playing depicts the rise of newspapers in America from zero at 1700 to 13,000 in 1913, and then a slow and steady decrease since then. So keep an eye on the date on the upper left-hand corner and the number of newspapers just below it. The rise of what at the time was a new media, cheap newspapers, created what I would call a sensory overload in the early 19th century. There were about 500,000 newspapers printed in 1790. Just 50 years later, there was 39 million. In terms of what was traveling through the U.S. Post Office, there were only 300,000 letters traveling in 1790. 50 years later, there was 41 million. For readers, the marketplace saying, buyer beware, could be translated into the phrase reader beware, because newspapers were a poison-laced smorgasbord of fiction and nonfiction, real news and fake news, advertisements, and just plain scams. With the invention of the telegraph in the 1840s, newspapers reprinted, or in our terminology today, they shared reports from other newspapers, usually without credit. And rumors and news alike spread like communicable diseases. It was through this social media that political parties rallied their bases, that groups like abolitionists and feminists and labor unions amplified their voices beyond their small numbers. And I want to share a couple voices from 19th century social media. The first is from an abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison, from the first issue of his single issue-based newspaper, The Liberator. It was designed solely to see the end of slavery in 1831. And in this article, the passage I'll read to you, he's already laid out the purpose of his paper. He's already laid out a radical position that slavery is a sin without comparison, that it violates the Declaration of Independence, that the proper remedy to this problem is not some future end, but an immediate end, and that once free, former enslaved people should have the right to vote and share all the rights of American citizens. And in this last part, he's responding to a common criticism. I think it's common in media at the time and it's common in media today, that ideas can be too radical, that tones can be too severe, and that tones can be too immoderate, that they don't lead towards a spirit of compromise. This is what Garrison says. I am aware that many may object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her baby from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. The apathy of the people is enough to make every statue leap from its pedestal and to hasten the resurrection of the dead. Social media in the 21st century, in the 20th century, and the 19th century helps amplify the voice of radical thinkers, whether right or wrong, on the extremes of political debates. Social media could also lead to violent confrontations. I'm sure you know who Abraham Lincoln is. You may not know that an anonymous newspaper article, an early form of social media bullying, nearly got him into a duel in 1842. Lincoln had written in 1842, under a pseudonym, a series of satirical articles against a Democrat in Illinois named James Shields. And one letter, which we don't know if it was written by Lincoln. It seems that it might have been written by Mary Todd, his fiancée, his future wife. But it went too far. It violated the decorum of the day. It ridiculed Shields' character. It pointed to Shields' vanity, and in particular his pursuit of women. I also think it gestures to Lincoln's humor, even if it was written presumably by Mary Todd. It says, Shields' very features in the ecstatic agony of his soul spoke audibly and distinctly. Dear girls, it is distressing, but I cannot marry you all. Too well, I know how much you suffer, but do remember it is not my fault that I am so handsome and so interesting. Now, Shields was highly offended by this. You may not find it so offensive today. Shields found it very offensive. He demanded the newspaper editor reveal the name of this letter writer, and this led to the Lincoln household, and this led to a challenge to a duel. Very well could have ended in the death of either Lincoln or the death of Shields, either of which might have been the end of Lincoln's career. Lincoln accepted the duel, but averted violence, not by appealing to pacifism, but as he was the person who was challenged to a duel, he had the right to select the terms upon which the fight would take place. Now, Lincoln's 6'4". Shields was 5'9". Therefore, Lincoln chose the type of weapon that would be least likely to kill him. He didn't want to put a gun in Shields' hand. He thought Shields might kill me if I do that. He chose heavy cavalry swords. the longest and the heaviest available, that would give an advantage to his wing spread, so to speak. They went out to an island on the Mississippi River, Bloody Island, well named, between Illinois and Missouri. And Shields called off the duel after seeing Lincoln take a few practice swings on a tree. So social media led to a confrontation. In this case, it didn't lead to violence. But by 1860, the rise of social media, more newspapers and more mail than ever before, indicated something that I think is important about the 19th century and our era, that greater communication does not necessarily make for a happier union. The social media that people in the early 19th century had thought would help create a stronger national identity, instead, by 1860, had created, in effect, two national identities. Two competing versions of America's economic and political destiny, one based on free labor and one based on slave labor. If you want to know more about that, take my Civil War and Reconstruction class next fall. My main point today is that our modern age of social media represents both change and continuity from the past. We are not disconnected from the experiences and the trials of the past. I do not think that modern social media inevitably leads to a more just, a more sustainable, a more peaceful world. But at the same time, I don't think, as pundits sometimes fear, that the dangers of social media are going to lead to a more intolerant, a more unsustainable, and a more violent world. That so much activism takes place through social media, to me, is not surprising. It took place through social media in the 19th century. It took place through social media in the 20th century. Where else, I would ask, would it take place in the 21st century? Thank you.
Hello. Hi. So before I get into my talk, just quickly, can I have a show of hands of how many people use social media in here? Show of hands. Okay. You can put them down. Does anyone not use social media? Just curious now. 3. Okay. Thank you. Congratulations to you 3. So when we think about the use of social media and your use of social media, how many people in here use it for social activism? Anyone? Activism? Okay, maybe 6, maybe. Okay, most of us though use social media as an outlet for fun, right? So when we talk about social media and activism, what inevitably we are talking about are social movements. Okay, so I'm going to do a little bit of backtracking in my talk to kind of give a little bit of context in terms of social media usage for activist purposes. So when we look at social movements in general are trying to figure out some sort of social change, right? We're trying to make social change happen and trying to make it happen as quickly and effectively as possible. And so social media became a really big part of this, and the Arab Spring obviously was a really nice jumping off start for this conversation. So when we look at generally what social movements are doing is that they're trying to fix something. They found a problem and are attempting to come up with a solution and attempting to talk you into and or persuade you of that solution. So an important and sometimes kind of confusing differentiation is that when we're talking about social movements, we aren't always talking about the movements themselves. So the civil rights movement, is that one singular thing? No, absolutely not. So when we're talking about things like social movements, we're talking about organizations. So for instance, Black Lives Matter, NAACP, Movement for Black Lives, et cetera, are all civil rights movements. So when we look at social media usage and the techniques that certain organizations use, it's based on those organizations. So when we look at the kind of framing, which is what I'm going to get into, it becomes really important to differentiate these kind of complex issues. So, when we think about framing, when you put things on your social media account, do you put you at your worst self? Anyone? Worst self? Oh, Michael, a little bit. Dr. Moyer, sorry. Oh, okay, great. So most of us put our best foot forward, right? We present who we want to be, who we desire to be. And that's similar for social movement organizations, right? They're putting forward what they want you to see, what will motivate you into being passionate about their topic. So when we look at framing, we're talking about how a message becomes an action, okay? We're looking at how certain messages motivate people over other messages. And so a lot of scholars of social movements have looked at this. And when we talk about kind of sociology that focuses in on social movements, the kind of main goal that we have for social movement research is to understand how and why these things occur, not necessarily the validity or kind of moral aptitude of it. And so when we look at these framing and framing for a goal, there's a few different ways that you can think about it. So the actual movement organizations have their own set framing. So talking about, for instance, Black Lives Matter organizations, they have their own, for instance, hashtag that they use. Now, that gets complicated, though, when you take into account media representations and media framing. Are media framing and the social movement organizations framing the same? Typically not, right? That's where it starts to break down a little bit. And then, of course, you have the issue of individuals. There we go. And the issue that social media has presented is that now every single person has a say in the conversation. Rather than previously, when we were looking at social movement organizations, the message could be really easily constrained. Right? Now, can someone tweet out something about Me Too without any sort of organizational support? Absolutely. And so that shifts the representation of the movement, and it shifts the success. So the success aspect is really important for the kind of framing techniques that these organizations tend to rely on. And so when we look at media in general, when media takes into account some sort of social movement organization or activity, is it positive or negative? The representation of it. It depends, right? Yeah. So it depends on the kind of news organization, and it depends on the movement itself. So, for instance, this is a New York Times post, right, with a 20-minute difference here. So on one side, right, it is very clearly placing the blame on one set of people, the other side shifting that blame. So when we look at media representation of social movements and how media writes up and frames that social movement, it's extremely important, okay? And that's why the social media aspect comes into play, right? Because we're able then to individually and organizationally kind of reframe that conversation, to tweet out things like this, right? This went viral when it first came out because it was such a stark shock. So it's not just the kind of blunt or blanket kind of framing. There's specific kinds of ways that social movement organizations use framing techniques. So first is just diagnosing the problem. And that can be, and I wrote my own, so feel free to giggle at them. The first is climate change is a problem, right? That is a very clear diagnostic frame. Now, the prognostic is how we fix it, okay? What the fix is. So I'm going to cut down on negative environmental impacts. Now, the motivational is how to go out and fix it, right? So for instance, tiny houses, right? And so when we look at all three of these frames, motivational is by far the most powerful, right? It gives you the problem and it tells you how to fix it. And this is what social media allows us to use, right? We're able to use these motivational frames in ways that people connect with, find meaningful, and then go make change from. So I'm gonna put up a statement, and I want all of you to read it, and I want a show of hands and agreement with it. Okay, so how many people agree? So feel free to read. Okay, so this is from a social movement organization. I'm not going to tell you who yet. Show of hands, how many people agree with this? Don't be scared, it's okay. Less than half? What do you find agreeable? Maybe safety, health, families, rights, right? Anyone want to guess what this is? You're all so scared now. I know. It is. It was the Women's March. So let's look at this again. Is there anything that is blatantly offensive in this?
That was why I was suspicious of it.
Exactly, yes. That is why you should have been suspicious. So when we look at organizational mission statements, this is their mission statement, what we see is that there tends to be really bland framing, tends to be bland language that is highly agreeable, that organizations like the Women's March use for positive effect, right? Because when you look at this statement, it is hard to disagree with. It is hard to find something extremely morally reprehensive about it. And so that's the power of framing. It allows organizations to open up to people who they wouldn't normally reach, right? Now, when you see this picture, does it have the same effect as the statement? No, absolutely not. And that's the point, right? The point is that there's a kind of cognitive dissonance between the statement and the actual representation of the movement. And that's how a lot of social movements frame themselves, in the most positive light possible. So when we talk about social media usage, and in particular hashtags in the field of sociology, social movements, there has been a lot of negative and kind of controversial conversations about it. Many people saw it as armchair activism, as not being serious, and clearly from today's conversation, we know that that's not the case, right? When we've been studying social movements and sociology for 50 plus years. And no one believed that social media would play such a big role. But clearly, because of framing, because of hashtags, because things like Google Trends, you can go look at the prevalence of a hashtag. You can go look at the prevalence of a social movement in a second, rather than having to interview people, having to wait. And so it's really changed the way that we organize, changed the way that we study this, and changed the way we're all able to come together. So that's it.
Thank you, panelists, for your opening remarks. Now we will move into the Q&A portion of this event. If you have any questions for our panelists, please raise your hand and one of our attendants with a microphone will bring you the mic. So to get things started, I would like to pose a question to our panelists. So, how does modern social media activism compare to past movements such as the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the feminist movement of the 1970s? And either one of you can answer it.
Historian, huh? I think, like I said, there's a great deal of change, but there's also a great deal of continuity. Whatever the predominant media is, medium of communication is at the time, social groups, political groups will utilize this. I mean, like the civil rights movement in the 1960s was one of television. And that's an important. It's an important thing to keep in mind. My big point is let's not think that we're somehow beyond history. That these previous movements, no matter how unique we think our present moment is, that there's a great deal of continuity between the past. That's what I have.
Well, I would like to add only a couple things. One is that in the past, social movements required a lot of organization, a lot of efforts before there could be a march. And now, using social media, it's possible to gather people fairly quickly. And the question has become, how does one channelize this energy that has erupted in other productive directions after a protest or an event has taken place? And so there are different questions and challenges that one is dealing with. The other thing that I would say is that I would agree with Dr. Kurtzler that it would be a mistake to think that this is a new thing that has suddenly happened over the last few years. I think it is instructive to look at previous historic protests and movements and learn from them what worked for those people, because some of those people worked under far more difficult conditions than activists face in today's times.
Thank you. We will now open the floor to you guys, so don't be afraid to ask questions. Oh, we have a question.
So this is really, I guess, for pretty much the whole panel, I guess. But I'd also like to ask a question of the room first. So how many of you guys have ever gotten into a social media argument with a stranger? And how many times have you actually managed to change the other person's mind? So I guess, what I'm, thank you. So what I'm asking about, what I want to ask about here, like this notion that Anish mentioned about Gandhi always meeting with his adversaries face to face. It's a lot easier to be cruel to people if you're not dealing with a real physical person sitting right across from you. That person becomes an abstraction. And I guess, to what extent do you think it's possible that a lot of social media activism is merely a kind of abstracted activism that's taking place in a space that is somehow separated from action in the real world?
Hello? Okay. Yeah. So, A, absolutely. But B, also, one of the things that social media has opened up for social movements is that it allows a broadening of narrative. So even though there might be kind of Facebook debates or Twitter arguments, right? The end goal and the tactics of the social movements are the same, which is bringing it back home, making it personal, and including personal narratives. And we've seen, as far as like successful social movements, those that have the highest amount of success personalize and have those kind of intimate stories that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily get just from hashtags, just from those 300 characters, right?
I I think that's a very relevant question in today's times. But one thing that we should also remember, and all that Michael said is true, of course, but one thing that we should also remember is that some of these protest movements and instances of activism happened because people agreed with one another. And disparate people agreed with one another. People who differed in significant ways had common interests, common motivations, common viewpoints, and they came together behind a cause. So while there is a problem on the internet involving social media, and that problem is real, it's definitely real, along with the other problem of some of the authorities now trying to control social media. There is also a good point about social media that people do agree with one another on certain issues and sometimes come together to fight for those issues.
Thank you for your question. You have a question? The microphone is burning.
This one is addressed to Dr. Davi, since you wrote a book about Trump's Twitter. Do you feel like there should be some form of restraint on the political severity that influential members of the government should have?
I actually published a book chapter analyzing his tweets. It wasn't a book, but maybe
Sorry.
I'll write a book someday. So to answer your question, definitely President Trump's tweets set him apart from previous presidents. President Obama also tweeted during his campaign and subsequently when he became president. But there weren't too many instances, or many of his tweets were by his staff, presumably. Whereas in the case of President Trump, we have seen that he tweets himself. And in a lot of those tweets, we read his voice. To refer to your question, I think because the United States has such a strong culture of free speech, it would be, in my view, it would be unwise to sort of impose restraints on expressions by public officials. Of course, if those expressions become irrational, then possibly there may be some consequences for that. But some people might point out to such officials that you need to be more restrained, and that has happened in the past with President Trump sometimes, as we read on news media. But in the chapter that I wrote, I actually looked at some specific foreign policy tweets and analyzed them for what they intended, what they meant, and how effective they might have been. And the tweets were, both good as well as problematic in some instances. But to cut my answer short, I think it would be unwise to impose restrictions as such on public officials tweeting, and that would include President Trump also.
Thank you. We had a question over here from one of our guests.
I have a question for Dr. Dave. When you were talking about Egypt, do you think the revolution would have happened if social media was not a choice?
Can you repeat the last part of that question, please?
Do you think the Egyptian revolution would have happened if the social media was not a choice for?
Well, it's not an easy question to answer. I do not want to sound deterministic that it's technology that created that revolution, but technology really helped the revolution. Social media helped the revolution. And before there was social media, there were few avenues through which people in Arab countries could express themselves with such power and such authority and such effectiveness. They were able to actually go around censorship and repressive measures and organize themselves into large groups, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people. And so without social media, I seriously doubt that it would have been such a strong expression, considering that the Egyptian dictator was actually deposed. He had to leave. Hosni Mubarak had to resign. And there were significant consequences of social media activism.
Thank you.
Does anyone have a question? Come on. We have a question over here. Here comes a microphone for you.
The common theme among all the movements was that they were leaderless, except for maybe, right? All of them were leaderless. What do you think about the influence of celebrities, apart from the Arab Spring? Because I was following, for example, the Women's March and the Me Too movement, and there was all of a sudden a really big support from celebrities, and also especially the Women's March. Everything became really organized really quickly, and it just, while it appeared that the cause and effect relationship, so like if the cause was the idea behind the movement, and then that attracted the celebrities, right? So that was the idea. But based on how quickly everything got organized, you know, the cause and effect relationship could be questioned. So that's my question.
So I think social or celebrities are a great influence in these movements, for sure. I think they have definitely brought more people into it due to their influence over people. I think a big example of that is, or a big example of how it could also split is Colin Kaepernick, for example, kneeling with the national anthem. It truly split, you know, NFL. People quickly drove away from the NFL, and people also came into the NFL, into watching and supporting the NFL because of that movement and how it was handled. So I think celebrities have a great influence both to and against some movements in a way.
And I would add to what Mark said. In the case of the Women's March, the event was actually begun by a Hawaiian grandmother who wrote on Facebook after President Trump's victory, surprise victory, that we should all get together and march on Washington. She wrote something like that. And from that Facebook post, which was shared by many of her friends, the whole march actually was made possible, or it happened because of that post. It all started from that post. And then subsequently, there were some well-known activists who were requested to help with the organization of the march on Washington. Celebrities entered when the march had already come into existence, or the idea of the march had come into existence, and then celebrities lent their support. And they also agreed to participate on the day of the march. Some of them came to Washington, D.C. for that. So speaking only about the Women's March, I see the role of celebrities as a role of people who enable such movements. But I still see that social media are these tools that allow common people to do activism if they are inclined, if they really support issues or causes.
I'd like to add to that one point. I think the connection between celebrities and social media activism is important. I also think it speaks to the fact that a lot of social media activism could also be explained as a form of consumer activism, which is also often led by celebrities. The case of Colin Kaepernick, right, and Nike, and the reactions against Nike. If you burned your Nikes after that, you were participating in a form of consumer activism. If you burned your New Balance shoes because you don't know what Nikes look like, you tried to perform a form of consumer activism. But it's also a way in which common people engage with what they think is right or wrong. And no surprise, that has a legacy all the way back to the Boston Tea Party and the colonial movements, and all the way from that point to the present. So, and there might be a danger in that. Even all the platforms we're talking about. Remember, this is you have to interact with a company as a consumer to participate in the public sphere now, right? If social media activism is the way of the future, our citizenship is almost secondary to our status as consumers, and that might be something to be cautious about as far as relegating our duties in a republic to just choosing what to wear, what to burn, and what to post. Thank you.
One quick comment. As the non-historian, actually, there is actually a historical legacy of celebrities being part of social movement organizations. And so it's not a new facet of social movement organizing. If you look back to second wave feminist organizing, Jane Fonda, right? If you even think to like women's suffrage movement and think of the quote unquote celebrities then, right? We could liken them to celebrities now like Alyssa Milano, although that's kind of woeful when you think about it that way. But anyway, there's a long history of using people whose voices are louder, using people with more social capital. And so I think that social media just allows for a wider availability of that.
Thank you. Any more questions? We have a question in the back. Over here.
My question is, what is something you wish people will understand about the importance of using their voice in the platforms that we have?
Great question.
Use social media to organize, but social media that does not end on the street or in the ballot box may not be likely to produce the change you are after.
Off of what Dr. Kutzler said there about the ballot boxes, just like the Get Out and Vote movement that took place this year, we had a outstanding turnout of voters, record-breaking numbers in some states, including Georgia. And I feel like that's a huge thing. I mean, like Dr. Kutzler was saying, get out, use your voice, and bring your voice to the ballot box.
Okay. Thanks for that answer. Any more questions? We have a question over here.
So with the increase in like the use of social media and this kind of development of a secondary public sphere, what sorts of changes do you think we might come to see in coming decades with actual sort of participation in real public interaction?
I don't think that anyone has a solid answer to that up here. But it's an excellent question because it's something that we've been thinking about for a long time. And we've been thinking about when, Twitter first started being a hub for activism, because we really weren't sure what was going to happen, if it was going to continue to be like cute dog pictures or if it was actually going to birth into something bigger. And so when we think about kind of the longevity of the use of social media in these kind of new spaces, the hope is that it will be able to give more voices to more people who are underrepresented, right? Who aren't able to voice or have access to voice their opinion in loud and powerful ways like politicians or like celebrities. But the pessimist in me is a little skeptical of that optimism and is a little skeptical of the kind of use of the voice to create solid change. Talking about going to the ballot, talking about actually creating social movement organizations rather than just hopping on a hashtag and hoping you get 200 likes. And so there's some issues in terms of participation level. And there's an issue in the literature called the free rider problem, where especially in social movement organizations that are online, people will free ride. We'll be like, I'm going to hop on this hashtag. This sounds like a great idea. And then that activism doesn't move anywhere else. So that's my optimist and pessimist answer.
Just to say the same thing that MC said, and what we have today is a culture that basically gets too confrontational too quickly, and you have strong divisions on different sides, and people like to interact with people whose views are similar to theirs, and they like to live in those echo chambers. And so that's one limitation of social media. Social media is, as a collection of media, it is not living up to its potential as yet. However, if we can think of ways to engage with one another using social media, recently there was this statement by the Google chief executive who said that technology doesn't solve humanity's problems, that humanity has to solve humanity's problems. Well, one can certainly understand why he says this, that you cannot overly rely on technology to solve our problems. But at the same time, the history of technology has been that technology has always solved humanity's problems, whether it is transportation or communication technologies or medical technologies. Technology has solved historically humanity's problems. So I think the technology companies have to come up with some ways to keep those mischief makers out of social media who muddy the waters and who basically create unsafe conditions for many other users. And along with that, I think a greater emphasis on civility and on engagement with even our adversaries and opponents, I think are good ways to move forward in that regard.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions on the floor? I have a question for the panelists. Do you think that social media has a potential to bring fair and just and a balanced coverage over social issues? How does social media play in a part of like news coverage and making sure that everyone's like voices and opinions kind of matter? Like how does social media play in that aspect?
Well, one benefit that you have with social media is that it has already empowered us to express ourselves. It has given us these tools to speak our minds. So it has created conditions where more people can participate if they want in their country's social and political structures. Of course, the constraints haven't gone away. The constraints remain, and the constraints differ in different countries. So, for example, in strong democracies, social media are much more useful in some ways, and in some other ways, they are much more useful in more authoritarian countries, where citizens are able to protest or make their views known, their opposition known. It would be difficult to really have very strict guidelines, although some social media platforms have begun to move in that direction. I know Reddit, for example, has very strict guidelines for what people can post on Reddit. I think with almost anything, we have certain ethical rules and certain norms that develop over a period of time. There is more professionalization of products and services. And my expectation would be that technology companies would begin to have a more professionalized approach to social media. And there will be some better guidelines for how people can use social media and what they should or should not do. That would not mean any restrictions on free speech, but certainly guidelines can help, and that's my hope, that some sort of guidelines will develop over a period of time. What exact shape those guidelines will take, I have no way of knowing right now, but I'm thinking that it would be a step in the right direction.
Thank you. We have sorry.
Just going on to the part of fairing up the media, I feel like social media has done a somewhat good job of actually having a fairer media than some news channels, because no matter what side of the political aisle you're on, conservative, liberal, independent, however you want to be, your voice is heard. You have a outlet to speak. Whether people agree with you or disagree with you is a different factor, but you have your input, and that's one of the great things about social media.
I think there also may be, at times, an illusion of that social media allows everybody to speak. I don't study this, but if I were going to coin the term, I'm sure it's already out there, but social media capital, in terms of, I mean, it's all about who you are, how many followers you have, and how you have kind of played the system to get your voice out there. I mean, certainly there are the occasional this person, from Southwest Georgia had this to say in a newspaper or in a news article. But quite frequently, it's the same celebrities, it's the same politicians over and over and over again. And my concern is that instead of empowering the disadvantaged, we may simply be empowering the already empowered. So yeah, I certainly think it has the potential to as a technology, but all technologies have a great deal of potential. And it's how humans use that technology that will determine whether or not that helps us or hurts us in the long run.
Thank you. We have a question in the back.
Rodney Caldwell, like when you stated that, like how social media and you stay in your certain atmospheres, like let's say you are like hard left side and you go on social media, you're not gonna like something that you don't agree with something, right? And so do you think like Reddit would be better for that in a way, because Reddit, you can find more unbiased opinions? Like if like Reddit, you can go through one section and you will agree with that one, but you can scroll down to the next section and that'll be the opposite side of what you believe in. You can learn a little bit more about why they believe in that. So do you think Reddit would be a better source of social media for a user or someone who wants to start any movement? So.
Yes and no. Like you were saying with Reddit, Reddit does provide some great organization for, your views. No matter kind of where you go, you'll see, you can look into different views. I think that's with anything though. On Instagram, who you follow kind of will determine what you see. So let's say you are hard left, hard right. You follow those sites, you'll see stuff from the hard left, hard right, and most of your recommended pages will also be that type of stuff. So I do think there is, with you're saying of looking into different views, I think that's a huge problem today is people don't look into the other side's views, because no matter what, humans are always going to be different creatures. I mean, each one of us are going to have our own viewpoints, and the environment is what shapes a lot of that. Your environment can shape your viewpoint. Somebody living, in the South tends to be more conservative than somebody living in the North. Urban areas and rural areas, same situation. Rural is typically more conservative, and that kind of influences what you post on your social media and your political viewpoints.
One thing that I would like to add to what he said is that I have a sense that it's good to use social media that works for you. If Twitter works for you for some reason, I don't see any reason why you should not use Twitter. If Facebook works, the same thing, and the same would apply to Reddit as well.
One thought on that question. It's a really good question, and I think a lot of these social media companies are not designed to facilitate that, right? Because what you like, yeah, sure, it'll show you more of what you like, but it's also, I mean, the bottom line is to sell you stuff, right? The bottom line is to find your advertising profile. So social media benefits by typecasting you. That, surprise, surprise, is also not a new phenomenon, right? In the 19th century, and this is where I think that social media can be unfairly attacked as creating this polarized society. No, we were polarized before that. And so in the 19th century, if you're a Whig, you read the America's Whig, or if you're a Democrat, you read the America's Democrat. You are told what to think, or you are encouraged to not reflect on your views by reading a party newspaper. That I think is not too dissimilar from some of the these issues of kind of siloing ourselves into our respective camps today, and unfortunately is one that kind of leads me to think that to get that balanced perspective, you either have to go to a well-established, generally known quantity in the media, whether it's the New York Times, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, or to be somewhat, I guess, politically voyeuristic in terms of wanting to see what's going on the other side, which I certainly find myself doing. So I know people do it, but I don't know if it's, and sometimes it changes my views. So unfortunately, the way that social media is set up and the way that a lot of media is set up is that you have to do it yourself. And I don't know if that's going to change.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. So does anyone have any more questions? Thank you. The time has come to bring today's discussion to a close. I would again like to remind students that tonight's event is a Windows to the World sanctioned event. If you would like to earn Windows to the World credit, be sure to swipe in with one of our representatives in the back of the room and be sure to complete the program assessment. I would like to thank the members of our panel for coming out today and Bob Seckner in Information Instructional Technology Department and the faculty and staff for their help. Thank you guys for coming to our day's event.